don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. Hello again, and thanks for tuning in. I always appreciate those folks who listen and share our work, should you be so inclined. A few announcements. First off, early bird registration is now officially open for our PBL Grow 24 event. So if you're an educator, whether you're a teacher or a school leader who wants to know more and build foundational understanding of project-based learning, this is a good event for you. June 24th through 26th in Louisville, Kentucky. We will return to the Fifth Third Club Room at Lynn Family Stadium, which was a great venue last year. And there you can learn project-based learning by doing project-based learning. And you can learn more about that event and register for early bird registration, which is available until March 31st at wegrowteachers.com/grow24. As always, all of our professional development is at wegrowteachers.com. But of course, we have our new Thought Stretchers education community, which is at thoughtstretchers.org. And I invite you to check that out and sign up, and especially take a look at the list of events that we have on slate for this spring and more to come. So February 25th, we'll be talking about the side effects of school. Does traditional schooling lead to poor mental health for students? We'll have Naomi Fisher, who is a clinical psychologist, and Michael Strong, who is the head of the Adolescent Flourishing Initiative at the new University of Austin. On March 13th, we will talk once again with Ron Richhart. This time, of course, you can participate and be a part of the book club author visit. His book, Cultures of Thinking and Action, 10 Mindsets to Transform Our Teaching and Students' Learning, will be the topic, and he'll, again, talk about that, and you'll get a chance to ask him questions. That's March 13th. March 27th, we will be talking about reading instruction with the author of a new book, Karen Gazeth, who gets into the neuroscience of reading instruction. And we'll also have Christy Biggerstaff, who's the Director of Early Literacy for the Kentucky Department of Education, and Sonia Thomas, who's the CEO of Nashville Propel, which is a parent advocacy group in Nashville, Tennessee. That's March 27th, Reading Instruction, Evidence, and Neuroscience. April 18th, we'll be talking with Bridget Blom of the Pritchard Committee and Rich Harwood of the Harwood Institute about a report and their work to build community-led schools. The name of this event for April 18th is Catalyzing Community-Led Change, Overcoming the Divisive and Narrow Politics of Our Time. And May 25th, which has been rescheduled from an earlier date in May, we'll be talking with Kath Murdoch about her new book and her work on inquiry. The book is titled A Journey Through the Landscape of Inquiry. And again, that's May 25th. You can find all of those at thoughtstretchers.org. And if you RSVP, you'll get a ticket in your email and be able to join us virtually. As always, please feel free to reach out to me with any comments, questions, concerns, or ideas at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. In this episode, I spoke with Jason Baehr, who is a professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount and the author of more than one book, but the one that we talked about was Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues. It was published in 2021, and Jason's work was something that came up in a previous podcast from November 21st of 2023, a title, Toolkit for Open Inquiry, where they had mentioned his work as being foundational. Certainly a really interesting conversation for me. As you'll hear, I kind of nerded out and wonked out. We talked about how he came to the idea of intellectual virtues as being important, his K-12 and career experiences that have led him there, the idea of deep learning or different types of learning and learning outcomes that are valuable and what that means, some of the distinctions that he makes in his work between understanding and knowledge and the connections between them. We also talked about some specific ways in which we can build understanding that might not be efficient in terms of sort of the direct and explicit instruction crowd and what they might advocate for, but the value of slow intellectual steps and why that's important. We touched on the idea of motivation and what is motivational for students and the issue of evidence and assessment. and how we know when students are developing these intellectual virtues. The last few things we touched on included the impact of this kind of an educational approach being evident more down the road and less immediately and easily measurable. And then he talked a bit about the school that they opened and has been open for 10 years and some of the ways in which they approached that. As you'll hear, I really like the idea of intellectual virtues and really enjoyed this conversation. As always, I hope it's helpful, and here is that conversation with Jason. All right, I am here with Jason Baehr. Jason and I are going to talk about intellectual virtues and all things related to that. But as I usually like to do, I want to give an opportunity to say hello and give a little background. Jason, who you are and what you do, and give a little context and meat to the bone before we get going here.
Sure. Thanks for having me and for your interest in some of my work. I'm a professor of philosophy. I teach at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Have been there just over 20 years. I work in a field called virtue epistemology. And virtue epistemology is an approach to the philosophical study of knowledge and knowing that emphasizes or prioritizes what are called intellectual virtues. And as I think about intellectual virtues, they are simply the personal qualities or character attributes that we need in order to think and learn well. So they aren't a matter of really like what you know. They aren't just a matter of intellectual skill. They are different from natural intellectual ability. Mm-hmm. They, again, are the personal qualities or characteristics, the character attributes that we need in order to be good thinkers and learners. And so they would include qualities like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual tenacity, intellectual courage, and the like. Another way to think about intellectual virtues is that they sort of sit or exist at the intersection of intellect and will, or sort of the mind and the heart. As most educators know, to be a good student, to be a good thinker, to be a good learner, it's not enough that we're just naturally smart or have certain abilities or skills, because you can have a lot of potential, have a lot of skills, but be unmotivated to use those things. Right?
So,
or to be, yeah, please.
Oh, I was going to say, sorry, I thought you were pausing there and I was going to jump in, but if you have something to finish, feel free.
Well, no, I'll just say that you can know a lot, you can be naturally very smart, you can have lots of skills, but if you aren't motivated to use them, you might be intellectually lazy or careless. Or if you're motivated to use them, but in ways that are sort of aimed at your own sort of standing or status, then you might turn out to be quite intellectually arrogant. Or lack in intellectual integrity or honesty. So intellectual virtues kind of capture that space in our character that is geared toward thinking and learning.
Yeah, so professor of philosophy, who takes your classes? Because you're talking a lot about learning, and I'm imagining it would be good for pre-service teachers, but is that the sort of bailiwick?
It's not. Unfortunately, at my university, there's a school of education that has a successful teacher training program, but the courses that I offer are in the College of Liberal Arts within the philosophy department. So, and I teach a range of courses from introduction to philosophy to logic to grad courses and master's level courses in philosophy. So it's mainly undergraduates and graduate students interested in philosophy.
Well, seems like it would be a really good course for pre-service teachers to take. And you say they're successful, and that I don't want to say they're not successful, but of course there's lots of criticism leveled at pre-service, education programs, and some of those things are about programming, and I won't ask you to criticize them,
No.
but yeah, it seems like it would be something that would be really useful.
Yeah. No, I don't disagree. The universities are structured in weird ways where there's not a lot of communication between different colleges within the university. I'll say, too, that the first 10 to plus years of my career, I was just writing about intellectual virtues at a very theoretical, technical, fairly abstract level. And a lot of my work still is in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
But it was about 10 years ago, so halfway through my career to date, that I had an interest in and had some opportunities to think about applying virtue epistemology to education. So in some ways, the work I do is very philosophical and not very practical, but then I'm also devoted to making that application to education as well in a lot of the courses I teach.
Right. And the book that is what I took a look at, and I had a conversation with Sarah Hartman Caverly and Craig Gibson, and that was published on November 21st, and they created and are sort of behind this basically a toolkit for open inquiry, and that's the name of it. So if you want to listen to that podcast, go on back there, but your name came up in there, and they said that your work was foundational for the work that they're doing, which of course is really resonant with us. The book is a 2021 book, if I'm understanding correctly, and it's Deep in Thought, a practical guide to teaching for intellectual virtues. And so, there are some practical things in there, certainly lots of sort of abstract and theoretical things. And I'm sure you're going to make some references. I'm going to make some references to that, and we'll put that in the show notes. How did you come to believe that intellectual virtues are so important, or like how did you come to this position in which you're really advocating and sort of I don't know if activist is quite the right word, but some sort of version of that?
Yeah, like I said, I started with an interest. My initial interest in intellectual virtues was very theoretical. In that epistemology and virtue epistemology are quite academic and technical fields, and highly theoretical. And so my interest for many years was in sort of the theory and just the theory. But I think part of what attracted me to that theory was that virtue epistemology kind of gave me some language and concepts to pinpoint and better understand and describe what I had been moved by and found quite impressive in various influential figures in my life. Thinking in particular of teachers that I'd had at various levels, where something about who they were. It wasn't just what they knew. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just what they did. It was something about their will, something about their character as it related to learning and knowledge and understanding that was profoundly moving and attractive to me. That was really kind of my invitation to education, to teaching, and to philosophy and the life of the mind. And so I think that's what kind of led me initially to be interested in intellectual virtues. And then, like I said, I wrote about these things and thought about them for a good 10 years. And occasionally during that period, I'd sort of step back and say writing a chapter on the structure of open-mindedness or intellectual courage, very philosophical, very abstract. I'd sort of step back and think, wow, what I'm writing about here are really the qualities that I want to try to impart to my students, that I wish my own children, I hope for my own children will get out of their education, that I wish I'd had more of in my own education. And so for years, I'd kind of thought about the fact that virtue epistemology was ripe for application to education. I just hadn't had the opportunity or the time to make that sort of move in my career. And then another story we can get to, going back then 10, 12 years, that opportunity sort of came knocking on my door, and now I probably spend half of my time thinking about intellectual virtues in an abstract way, and half of it in a very, very concrete, practical way in school settings and working with teachers and so on.
So you mentioned your education, and you wish it had a little bit more of this, or maybe a lot more of this. What was that like? What was your educational, sort of K-12 experience, and then, matriculating through, and maybe even a little bit more like, what about your parents and your upbringing? What kinds of things do you think were causal factors in sort of getting where you are now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say my own experience. Here's my experience as a K-12 student. I was one of those kids who got good grades, did well in class, but where school and learning were kind of beside the point. But I was not intrinsic. I wasn't. I mean, there were moments I can look back and think about. I remember doing these homework assignments in the 6th grade in a history class where I found myself like going above and beyond what was required, and really trying to like acquire and demonstrate mastery of content. But so there were flashes of that at various points, but for the most part, I'm thinking even up through high school, got good grades, did well in class, but was really more interested in other aspects of my experience. So the intrinsic motivation didn't run very deep. And in fact, it wasn't probably until halfway through my undergrad experience as an English major that I felt like I was introduced to the life of the mind, or introduced to sort of deep learning for its own sake. And it was through I was an English major. I had a couple of Shakespeare classes and a Milton class from a particular professor who I think modeled a lot of intellectual virtues. And it was through a very close reading of Paradise Lost that I felt like something ignited in me in the direction of a kind of intellectual passion and real deep learning for its own sake. And that was kind of the beginning of one part of my intellectual journey.
And then so public school, private school, and then matriculated to
Public school.
College.
Yep, public school, public university as an undergrad, and then did a master's degree in what was basically philosophy and theology, and then thought I would teach high school English. But decided maybe I want to teach philosophy, and there aren't a lot of teaching jobs in philosophy at the high school level.
Right.
So initially I went to grad school in philosophy just so I could teach philosophy. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school for a year or so that I realized, I might actually be able to do philosophy as well, not just teach it. And that was virtue epistemology was what I wrote my dissertation in, and then just have been thinking and writing about a lot of those issues, theoretical and applied, ever since.
Well, you mentioned deep learning, and one of the things folks who are familiar with my work will know is that I have, especially lately, been really interested in and having conversations about sort of what I would say sort of the spectrum of sort of educational pedagogical approaches, sort of a more traditional, I would describe sort of on one end, direct and explicit instruction. I know you mentioned that in the book. You say direct instruction. Some people call it explicit instruction. There are some differences, but we'll just use direct instruction as a sort of proxy, which isn't completely fair to those terms, but good enough, I think, for this conversation. Maybe not. Maybe there are some distinctions worth making. But that sort of on one end of the spectrum and more traditional version, and then sort of on the other end, the progressive, at the more traditional end, the sort of worst version of it, people would say drill and kill lecture, very teacher centered, lots of transmission of information, those kinds of things. But certainly direct and explicit instruction is not supposed to be that. On the other end, I would say is something like, certainly more progressive, inquiry based, those kinds of things. Discovery learning probably being, sort of free learning where kids are directing their own education and those experiences, and then pulling it back a little bit towards the middle, something more like what we advocate for, project-based learning, which you mentioned in the book, inquiry-based learning, which we do a lot of work with. And as I sort of dive into those, what people say is a dichotomy, and I maintain, and I think your book maintains or asserts this as well, is that direct instruction is important, that inquiry is important, and mixing the two is important. But when I have those conversations with people, what strikes me is we are talking often past each other in terms of what we mean by learning. What are the educational outcomes we're after? So I'm curious how you define that. I mean, deep learning is one of those things. I've talked with John Hattie, surface, deep, and transfer learning. That's one way to think about it. Deeper learning is a big, buzzword in education right now. What exactly that means, I'm not 100% sure when I hear them talk or when I see their work. I'm curious how you, especially like in a K-12 setting, I guess define or operationalize that term learning and sort of the outcomes that we should be after.
Yeah, gosh, good question. And I should say, probably just from the outset here, I'm not an expert in learning theory. I'm not an education expert even. I have a passing familiarity with a lot of these discussions that you just mentioned in educational theory and philosophy of education. So I tread somewhat lightly on this territory here.
Fair enough.
I will say that I'm with you in the sense that neither the sort of totally student-focused way of thinking about learning nor a certain way of thinking about sort of a mastery focus is appealing to me, or sits very well with, I think, an approach to education that gives a central role to intellectual virtues. And here's how I would describe that. There can be if the goal is just for students to develop knowledge and understanding, it can be tempting. I don't think this is right, but it can be tempting to think that, okay, something along the lines of the banking model of education, and where my goal is to just get knowledge into students' heads, and for them to, and therefore my role as a teacher might be to make things as clear and precise and organized and structured as possible, so that all my students have to do is sort of sit back and absorb and take in the information. Right, that relegates them to a very passive role, which I think is problematic in various ways. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, where learning is entirely student focused. And where, in the extreme, not probably that realistic cases, there are real cases here, but they're extreme, where students get to dictate what's learned and what the objectives should be and so on. That doesn't sit especially well with how I think about these things either, only because as I think about intellectual virtues, they are aimed at deep understanding. So in other words, I exercise curiosity or open-mindedness or intellectual humility in my effort to know and understand a topic or a subject matter or a point of view. Where what does that mean? Well, it looks like I would tie deep understanding here to the ability to make connections between the relevant ideas, to see what's primary, to see what's secondary, to be able to offer an explanation of what is understood. And so the content mastery matters with this kind of approach, because it's what intellectual virtues aim at. But the reason that the sort of passive approach is problematic, to go back to the other extreme, is that to really understand something, we have to exercise our own agency in our pursuit of that understanding. Right? We don't learn as much when we just have to sit back and absorb. We learn more when we wonder and inquire and puzzle and calculate. And so, on my view, what a good education looks like is it's active. It makes demands on our agency, on our will, on our values, but it's also focused on and moves towards something that is objective, a kind of understanding of and grasp of subject matters that are worth learning about. So I'd like to think that the language of intellectual virtues could be useful for unpacking the kind of middle ground that necessarily takes seriously the importance of learning and content and mastery, but that also is student focused in the sense that it's about helping cultivate the habits of mind, the thinking dispositions, the qualities of will that we need in order to think and learn well.
So one of the things in one of your chapters is about understanding, and this is a point that I make sometimes with the importance of knowledge being what it is. And I do think there's a valid criticism of sort of the more progressive educators or people who are a bit more abstract in that, and then, they'll say things like, we don't know what kids need to know and go in the future, and they have Google, they can find it, all of those kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And while there's certainly some truth to those things, they don't particularly resonate when it hits the ground. Like, I do find it, I'm sympathetic at least to the and I think you mentioned E.D. Hirsch in the book, mm-hmm. the idea that we do have, there's some real value to shared knowledge as a society and culture. You talk about knowledge, I think, in service of understanding and in service of these intellectual virtues. And I'm curious if you can maybe, a little bit unpack that relationship a little bit more between how you think about it between knowledge and understanding, and also, like, is Bloom's taxonomy a useful sort of framework for you? Is it depths of knowledge, or are there other sort of frameworks that make more sense as you think about it?
Yeah, I don't have a very well worked out answer to the second question in terms of being able to connect how I'm thinking about understanding, say, to Bloom's taxonomy or other structures that are there. But I think that's in the right. I do think that's in the right direction. So mm-hmm. I think taxonomy could be a useful way of understanding sort of the progress from what we might describe as sort of first maybe just something like belief, mm-hmm. to then knowledge, to then understanding. So I can believe something without knowing it, right? I might not have any good evidence or basis for believing it. But I can also know certain things or know a lot of facts about a particular subject matter without really seeing how those facts connect, without seeing what's fundamental in a given subject or domain, without being able to explain how things work in that domain. And that's a difference between knowledge and understanding. So there is a kind of progress in depth and complexity, progress in sort of insight, and a kind of grasping of how things work. And I think the more that we move along that continuum, the more we're moving from something like mere opinion or belief to something like genuine knowledge, and then even understanding. And then we could even talk about wisdom, whether theoretical or applied, as a category that maybe is a type of understanding, but that is in some sense even beyond and superior to understanding.
So thinking about the practical pieces, and you mentioned quite a bit in this book, Ron Richhart and the Thinking Routines, Visible Thinking. I actually just recorded a podcast with Ron about his new book. I don't know if you've seen his new book, but he has a new one. And by the time this one is out, that one will have been out. But by the time, as we're talking right now, it's not out yet. But it's really, I mean, we love his work. We use his work. Some of the things that you mentioned in the book, certainly things that we use in our work. Maybe this is a good spot. So, and I know the book was released a couple years ago, so this might be a challenge for you, but to remember. But one of the examples that you use is a circle of viewpoints, which is a thinking routine. And you talk about or write about how you use that to build understanding. And one thing that I think is maybe useful is to sort of unpack that and talk through that, how you think about that, because as I think, most people who are more traditional, more, direct and explicit instruction folks would not be in favor or would not typically find the work of Ron and Harvard Project Zero, those thinking routines, as particularly efficient. And that's a lot, they use the word efficient a lot, and it may or may not be. But I do think that efficiency is important, but it's certainly not the only thing. So to give listeners an idea of how you think about those connections and using something like that to actually get to some, I guess, deeper learning or understanding.
Right. So circle of viewpoints is a thinking routine that involves taking up different perspectives in a very structured way, taking up and sort of exploring different perspectives on a particular object or event, or it might be a painting or other work of art. But if we look at, if we think about it, let's think about the application of this routine to either an historical event or maybe an event within a work of fiction. And the idea would be that again, in a very structured way, we invite students to identify different perspectives on the particular event, and then to try to enter into these different perspectives and ask how things look, ask what's important, and so on from that perspective. And then to sort of, at a further step, sort of take a step back and reflect on, okay, how did things look different? How did the event look different once we took the time and effort to enter empathically into these various perspectives? And what I like about this routine and thinking routines in general is that they really kind of slow the learning process down and force you to kind of take various intellectual steps in a very thoughtful and deliberate way. And in this case, to my mind, one of the ways that this exercise can facilitate understanding is that it can help you, better understand various perspectives on a given topic, right? And most topics worth learning about are complex. They aren't simple. And so to understand them, we need to be able to think about them from multiple perspectives. And this is a structured way to practice virtues like curiosity and open-mindedness and intellectual humility. And through practicing these virtues, considering multiple perspectives, and asking good, thoughtful questions, recognizing the limitations of our own perspectives, that can help us better grasp and wrap our minds around the complexity of the event or the issue that we're talking about. So I might think of it as sort of a structured exercise for appreciating and grasping complexity, which is something that, of course, today a lot of us don't have a lot of room for when it comes to thinking about topics that matter.
So I can imagine the pushback might be, the one, I mean, you said the word slow, and that's antithetical to efficiency, right? So we want to make sure that we're working and using as much of the time as we possibly can, most efficiently. But they would also say something like, well, the complexity, fine, it's important, but they need knowledge to be able to do that. So where does that come in? How do they get the knowledge in order to do that level of complex thought?
Well, I understand the tension, and I think that it's real. And I think that in this case, with so much of education, we have to do the best we can within the limits that we have. But I think it would be a false dichotomy to suggest that exploring these different perspectives isn't facilitating knowledge. I think it is, because what you're trying to do is look at different perspectives and give some time to understand different perspectives on a given event or item. And in doing so, you are wrapping your mind around the complexity of the reality that is in that event. And that's learning. Now, I understand that may be going deep with a particular topic or issue at the expense of a certain kind of breadth. And so I do think that tension is real. But again, I think it's one that we just have to do our best to balance. But I think that something like a circle of viewpoints and so many other thinking routines really are about depth of understanding and the ability to explain and make connections. And yes, they can take more time. And yes, they sometimes come at the expense of being able to cover more material. But again, I think we have to do our best to just strike that balance within the limits that we have.
Yeah, so I suppose there's an issue of prioritization of values that's part of this, right? It's the depth versus breadth. It's what do we prioritize? And it's not that one or the other is not valuable. One might be more valuable to certain people. And that idea, again, in entering into this is, where are the students and what do they need? Are they so far behind in their knowledge and content and understanding of, sort of foundational pieces that you focus on those things maybe more than intellectual virtues? One would say maybe that's a false dichotomy as well. I might. Maybe a question here, because you used, I think, the term sort of slow intellectual steps, which I think is a really interesting sort of phrase. Why is that so important in your mind? Why is that sort of slowness versus the efficiency so important?
Well, to go back to the distinction between knowledge and understanding, we all know as students and as educators that a cursory knowledge of something often doesn't stick, doesn't last very long. Whereas under the understanding of a concept or a topic is more sticky. It has a longer shelf life. And these thinking routines are aimed at understanding, not mere knowledge. And so one value in using them is that it can lead to a grasp and understanding of the subject matter that's likely to outlast the final exam or the assessment or whatever. Where again, I understand, like, if we want to be efficient relative to the goal of students demonstrating knowledge of a given topic at a given time, then the frequent use of thinking routines might feel frustrating and not very efficient. Right. But we have to step back and ask, Okay, but is that really the goal, for them to demonstrate knowledge of the subject matter at a given time? Will they still be able to will they still have that knowledge a month, a semester, a year later? Not to mention, what have we done for the cultivation of their own of students' intellectual dispositions?
Mm-hmm.
Right? We can teach to the test. We can be successful at teaching to the test, but often in doing that, we do so at the expense of their own formation as learners. And the nice thing about thinking routines and the like is that they are both geared toward understanding and a kind of cognitive mastery, but they also create space for the formation of students' intellectual character, and for a role for their agency, and their values and their desires to sort of come into play. And so they serve both the end of understanding and a kind of formative or formational end that most of us think of as important to education as well.
Yeah, well, one of the other things that you had mentioned before is sort of a balance, and I think that is a really integral part of this, and not advocating for a swing to one side or swing to the other. The motivation is something that you talk about, in the book, and the claim that I hear is that having success, academic success, being able to figure something out or understand it, know it, is I suppose intrinsically, I don't know if they would use the word intrinsically, but that it is motivating, that it's really awesome, so awesome to have mastered something that is propelling. I find that to be a little dubious. Certainly in some cases, right? You can have a sense of exhilaration of mastering your multiplication tables or remembering the 50 states or whatever it might be. Maybe and probably more so the more complex those things are. But to me, the idea of intellectual, you say dispositions and intellectual virtues, and Ron Richard in his new book talks about, I don't know, he may talk about it before, but I noted it here in this new book, is the difference between informational learning and what he calls transformational learning. And therein lies, whether there's probably other ways to frame it, but there are differences in those sort of outcomes that I mentioned earlier, right? This sort of informational learning that is, at least the way that I think about it, has a low ceiling. But it's easier to do, I think, although direct and explicit instruction can be done poorly, and it can be demotivating. It can be, just the same that inquiry learning can be done poorly, and it can feel like it's a mess, and kids are all over the place, and it's a train wreck. But that sense of being really understand, or I guess really manifesting those intellectual virtues or these intellectual virtues in ways that are, I'll use the term, and maybe it's not quite appropriate to this, but there's sort of an intellectual seduction that that deeper thinkers tend to engage with. And so I don't know if you've seen that distinction, that informational versus transformational, or maybe there's some other versions of it that you've had. So I don't know what you think about any of that.
Yes. A few thoughts. What I like about one of the last things you said there is this idea that learning, I mean, I teach at a Jesuit university, and we talk a lot about the education of the whole person, and I know we hear that language in other spheres as well. But the idea that learning should engage the whole person is, I think, a compelling and an attractive one, an intuitive one to a lot of instructors. But when we think about on certain ways of thinking about sort of intellectual mastery, it doesn't engage the whole person, right? It engages really only a certain part of the mind, or brain. And one of the nice things about intellectual virtues is, again, that they provide a kind of language, and they provide the sort of conceptual resources for thinking about and articulating what it might look like for a student to be engaged as a whole person, right? So how do they fare in the context of intellectual struggle? Are they tenacious? Do they persevere? Do they tend to sit back and wonder and practice virtues like curiosity or inquisitiveness? Do they have a good sense of the sort of limitations of their own evidence or perspective? Do they have a keen sense of their own cognitive fallibility? That is, are they intellectually humble? So it provides a language to sort of talk about or articulate the ways in which learning is seductive to, or can be seductive to students, the ways in which it can engage the whole person. I also think, one of the first things you talked about there was this idea that success at learning is its own reward, right? Mm-hmm. And I also have mixed feelings about that. So if by success we mean a student's ability to demonstrate a certain kind of knowledge of a given subject matter at a time, right? Then yeah, I'm not sure that maybe for some students that'll be a kind of intrinsic reward, but there's a difference between the sort of student being able to sort of regurgitate the key information from the course on the one hand, and what I would again describe as sort of a deeper, more complex, explanatory understanding of a subject matter, or the ability to connect the subject matter to other things they care about, to other things they've learned about in other classes. Mm-hmm. The ability to sort of see connections and make connections does strike me as a more attractive and motivating, I'll say, epistemic end, or goal. Now, it's not going to be equally motivating for all students, but there again, you don't facilitate that kind of understanding by just taking the teaching to the test or drill and kill sort of model or approach to teaching. You have to be able to teach in ways that invite students to wonder, invite them to make connections, invite them to ask questions, and so on.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think about how folks that are more traditional in nature might respond. Mm-hmm. And one of the things is evidence. And you talk about assessment. You have I think a whole chapter on assessment in the book. Mm-hmm. And I'll just read. So you have 9 intellectual virtues. I think it's probably makes sense to get them out so that people actually know what the heck we're talking about here. You've mentioned some of them. So Curiosity, intellectual autonomy, intellectual humility, attentiveness, intellectual carefulness, intellectual thoroughness, open-mindedness, intellectual courage, and intellectual tenacity. So those are the 9. But then there's the evidence, the assessment, right? So when I interact with people and say, well, is there more than just sort of knowledge mastery, things that are quantifiable, metrics, tests, things mm-hmm. that we're all very familiar with, and not unimportant, but certainly not my unique position is that they're not the only thing, that there is more, that the ability for me, one of the big abilities is being able to ask great questions, that idea that you can frame problems accurately and smartly with the inquiry process in order to do something and do it well, and that takes some modeling, that takes some intentional work, and sometimes even direct instruction on that kind of thing. And the response is, well, how do you measure that? Like, how do you know that they are doing that? And I certainly have some answers for it, but I'm curious how you think about that, whether it's about questions or, I know you've got a self-assessment for these intellectual virtues. Like, how do you think about the assessment piece and the actual evidence? Because it's easily quantifiable, I don't think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, character is a difficult thing to measure because it's psychological, it's complex. But fortunately, the ability to measure character, intellectual character in particular, needn't be an all or nothing thing, right?
Right.
The question is, can we get a good enough sense of how students are doing with these virtues to, make it worthwhile to be trying to foster these virtues and to get a read on how our students are doing with respect to them. And I think the truth is that with a lot of these virtues, we already measure for them. Take something like intellectual carefulness or thoroughness, right? Let's hope that our assessments don't let students who are careless or superficial in their thinking perform well in our courses. So there are some virtues that we already measure for to some extent. Similarly, when we ask students to make conjectures or form a thesis or defend a position, we are and when we assess them on those things, we are in some respects assessing for virtues like intellectual autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
In philosophy, at least, I realize this applies differently in different subject matters, but anytime I assign a philosophy paper, and I'm not unique in this way, one of the things my students have to do is consider possible objections to their perspective or their thesis. And it's very important that they consider objections that are intelligent and thoughtful, not straw man objections, right? And I think we have a good enough sense of what counts as an intelligent objection or a straw man objection to assess for these things. We do it all the time. And so by insisting that our students consider thoughtful, intelligent objections to what they think, we're assessing their ability to practice a virtue like intellectual humility. Now, I think it's really interesting that you mention asking questions, because that's one thing that I think we often don't assess for, but could.
Mm-hmm.
We often invite students to wonder or ask questions only of the form, like I don't understand this, or can you explain this, right? Like do you understand? Is everybody following me? Is everybody understanding? Right? Like we don't invite them to wonder as an end in itself, right? Or we don't invite them to actively formulate good, thoughtful questions.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's something that we should do a lot more of across domains. And I know there's literature out there that I'm sure you're familiar with that does capture the features or characteristics of good, thoughtful questions and questioning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see why those criteria couldn't be used to assess for virtues like inquisitiveness or curiosity. But that virtue in particular, I think will require a shift for a lot of teachers in how they tend to approach their subject matter, to ask them to create opportunities for their students to wonder and ask good questions. And of course, there are lots of ways that can be done.
Yeah, I wonder how you think. I know you make some mention of rubrics in the book. And I'm wondering how you think about rubrics, and maybe because you're not working in an education program specifically or pre-service, this is maybe a bit outside of your expertise. But we really advocate for, I don't know if you've heard of single point rubrics, but that idea is instead of the sort of boxes and charts that category, you have a category and a score of 1, 2, 3, 4, some version of that. And oftentimes those, they don't have to be, but they often are quantitative language, right? Uses 5 or more vocabulary words or something like that. And a single point rubric would be something where it's more simple, like 3 or 4 pieces, categories, not. And then you have one version of it, at least, is you have on one side, evidence that they're meeting or exceeding that sort of standard, and then evidence that they're falling short of it. And we really advocate for, instead of having quantitative language in the sort of the middle, as it were, if we're talking about a presentation, so the delivery, right? So meets the needs of the audience effectively, or something like that. So it's a qualitative guiding statement. What would the evidence be of that? Well, it would be quantitative things like, kept eye contact, or, those kinds of things, which for me is a wonderful leverage point to open up some of those intellectual virtues of curiosity and critical thinking, and that assessment piece. And so it isn't as quantifiably accessible, but it is something, and this is, where it gets messy or messier, that there's some subjectivity. There is not a hard and fast, exact, it can't be scored by a Scantron, that kind of thing. Right. And I might be dating myself with the term Scantron, but I don't know, maybe they still use those.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know, like, how you think about rubrics and any of that.
Yes, that is pushing the limits of my, it's beyond the limits of my expertise, and it's pushing the limits of my what I've thought about very hard. But what you say there definitely resonates with me, and matches, I think, just sort of my own approach as a teacher to these things. I don't try to assess for these things in ways that are numerically quantifiable, but I assess for them all the time, in more or less explicit ways. And it does tend to come down to what are particular thinking moves that the student is making or not making, in what they've presented or what they've written. And I do think that for every intellectual virtue, there are certain characteristic intellectual actions or thinking moves. Mm-hmm. And so if I were a teacher and I wanted to get a read on whether my students are practicing, certain virtues, I think one of the most important things I'd need to do would be to say, okay, first let me get clear on what are the thinking moves characteristic of this virtue, and then in general, and then what would it look like for my students to engage in these thinking moves on this assignment, or with this subject matter in this class. So getting clear on those things on the front end, and then once you have, I think it's not too hard to bring those criteria to bear on an evaluation of their work. It's not going to give you a point value, perhaps, for each virtue, but there's a place for point values in assessment, but I don't think that intellectual character assessment is one of those.
Well, I'd like to maybe introduce one additional intellectual virtue, or one that strikes me as maybe belongs in the pantheon. I'm curious how you think about this. Yeah. So the idea of intellectual dexterity, and being able to really move quickly and sort of play with ideas and do that in a way that is powerful, impactful, that takes a lot of knowledge. It takes quite a bit of understanding. And I don't know if you've heard that term, or how that kind of thing plays into how you think about the intellectual virtues.
Yeah. I should make clear that list of 9 that you read is not at all intended to be exhaustive.
Okay.
It's a rather long list.
I thought they were etched in stone.
Not that I'm aware of. Maybe I'm etched in bookmarks and on some walls at various places, but no, not at all. And I can't say I've seen an article or a book chapter on intellectual dexterity per se. But yeah, it makes sense to me. Maybe sometimes hear about intellectual flexibility. I think one thing that I'd want to think about was thinking more philosophically in approaching the idea of dexterity as an intellectual virtue. Yeah, I want to be clear that we're not talking just about a skill, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we need to imagine someone who I think intellectual virtues involve skills, but they aren't reducible to or the same thing as skills.
Yeah.
So to conceptualize intellectual dexterity as a virtue, I think we need to imagine someone who has a kind of nimbleness of thought and who uses that ability to advance their learning or the learning of others, who has sort of good judgment about when and how to use that ability,
Mm-hmm.
and so on. And yeah, it seems quite plausible to me that if you have that ability and you've internalized it in the relevant way, and it has the right kind of motivation and the right type of judgment associated with it, that it could be an important part of who you are
Mm-hmm.
as a thinker or a learner. So yeah, I like that.
Yeah, and I think similarly, like as I think about it being a virtue, I think maybe it's a skill, and maybe there's an important distinction to be made there. But it does really seem to me, and I don't want to toot my own horn here, but the idea that because these things are, as I'm sure you would agree, they're not isolated, right? You don't have curiosity, you don't have humility, like they don't operate in a vacuum.
Right.
And one thing that I know about myself and other people have noticed about me, I have many faults and many weaknesses, but one, I have, especially in the education space, the ability to have conversations with lots of different people, and one might call that intellectual dexterity. I'm very curious. I'm open-minded. I'm trying to be intellectually humble and all of those kinds of things. But it does mean that I have to know what I'm talking about, right? I have to, one, be able to add something to the discussion, and this is where that knowledge and understanding comes in. But I also have to be able to know enough to be able to ask really good questions and important, Warren Berger would say, beautiful questions. And that, to me, is sort of in accordance with intellectual dexterity. And maybe a question, I'm curious how you think about this. I've been thinking about this a lot lately in terms of like the importance of the sort of more informational learning and the immediacy of that and how that shows up versus something more like what we're talking about, that we might see evidence of it in small forms and it sort of germinates in the K-12 space and then starts to grow through the higher education space and into adulthood. And I can tell you from my own experience that I did not have intellectual dexterity as a high school senior, right? Maybe I had more than some of my peers, maybe not, I don't know. But that seems to me, and this is a fundamental problem of how we engage with students and this sort of argument about, more traditional versus more progressive, is that, well, you're not going to see evidence of some of these intellectual virtues that you're cultivating and germinating until very often, and maybe almost always, until well down the road, as other pieces of the puzzle, sort of, you're adding clay to it, you're adding information, you're adding experience, and all of those kinds of things. So, one, I'm curious to your thoughts about that, and two, do you know more about that, or are there studies and research or writings that people might, myself included, might engage with about that kind of thing?
Yeah, so, on the point of intellectual dexterity, one of the things I was thinking about was that you alluded to was, how's this related to other virtues, and is it sort of parasitic in some sense on other virtues and qualities like autonomy and tenacity, and you mentioned curiosity, intellectually. Yeah, I think you're exactly right to think of these things as deeply intertwined and overlapping. I mean, I still think it could have a sort of space of its own within this sort of intellectual economy here. But yeah, I think like most virtues, it's going to be, the philosophers talk about the unity of the virtues. It's going to be unified in certain ways with other virtues. So just that as a quick point. And then yes, I mean, I do think that I don't think it's true that there are many, if any, virtues that can only be exercised by adults. I think what a virtue looks like will depend in important ways on the developmental stage that one is in. And certainly I think one's ability to practice certain virtues can be helped or hindered based on one's developmental stage. So for instance, the ability to explore alternative perspectives for adolescent boys is going to be somewhat hindered by what's going on in their own brain development at the time. Does that mean that they can't practice open-mindedness at all? No, it means that what open-mindedness looks like relative to them is going to be different than what it's going to look like for them or others when they're older.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to limit our thinking to about these things to later developmental stages. But you're right that what they look like will vary from one developmental stage to another, and sort of the fullness with which we can express them or develop them will depend on where we're at. And then the idea that these are things that sort of unfold and emerge over time, I think that's exactly right too. Again, I would want to caution against a dichotomy that says that we can't expect to see any growth or change within the short term or middle term, that any meaningful change is going to have to happen somewhere down the line. I don't think that's true, but certainly I think that a large part of what we're doing as educators when we try to educate for intellectual virtue is planting seeds and germinating. And I think that's exactly the language or metaphor to use, that in lots of ways we are planting seeds that we hope other teachers and experiences and the students themselves will water and fertilize and cultivate and nurture over time. And that's important to keep in mind, because certainly if I've certainly met educators who are enthusiastic and excited about this idea of teaching for intellectual virtues in a way that gives me some pause, right? That makes me think, oh dear, is this person going to radically alter their approach to teaching with the expectation that their students will, in a short period of time, be radically transformed? And I think we have to be realistic. We shouldn't be naive. And so that means having realistic expectations for the kind of impact we can have in the short term. But it also means maintaining hope that for a significant number of our students, we are planting seeds that will come to fruition at a later date. And that happens with some students is something that many of us know from personal experience, either ourselves or with students that come back years later and say, oh, at the time,
right,
this. And I find, I incorporate some emphasis on intellectual virtues in most of the undergraduate courses that I teach. And just so often in course evaluations, or when I see students on campus, in subsequent semesters, so often I have students say to me, the best part of your course was the emphasis or focus on intellectual virtues, and these are ideas that have really stuck with me. interesting to me because that's always a kind of ancillary focus of my course. It's something that I'll introduce at the beginning of the class, connect it to the goals of the course, and something that we'll often talk about at various points throughout the semester, but it's ancillary to the primary content of most of my courses. But I find that it sticks. And sometimes they realize it at the time. Sometimes they don't realize it for a semester or 2 semesters or a couple of years later.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a sort of intellectual seduction there, I think, that is important to I guess, draw students in and connect, and it does stick. And, I've had some of those same kinds of experiences with the work that I've done and my time in the classroom, and people coming back as adults and saying, that really stuck with me. And those are the things that were really episodic and that kind of thing. And it also strikes me as you were talking, that evidence shows, sort of the science of learning people show, that sort of critical thinking skills don't transfer across domains. And it makes me wonder, well, first of all, there's a distinction, I think, between sort of specific processes that a scientist or a historian might use, and those are, I think, very domain specific, but sort of a more global, macro kind of mindsets or intellectual virtues, I think, probably do questioning, and that's at least why we will focus on it so much. But we look for evidence, and science of learning looks for evidence. And is it measurable? Well, it may not be measurable because it's not showing up right away, but down the road you're having these sort of residual effects. So I know that you have you mentioned in the book there's a school that maybe you want to say some things about, and I guess any other pieces that, because there's a lot more in the book than we've talked about in your work, but anything else that you want to sort of get out on the table before we do the requisite sharing of links and places people should find you and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, here are just a couple of thoughts that have come to mind as we've been talking that I haven't had quite a place for yet. And then I'll mention something about the school that you just mentioned. One, I think that I've just in years now of teaching and interacting with educators in the K-12 space and in the university level, I think that the language and concepts of intellectual virtues can just be a really rich, compelling way of articulating and better understanding what got many of us into teaching in the first place. We did not get into the profession to teach for the test, right? To help our students score well on standardized assessments. Most of us got into teaching because we felt like learning could be transformational, that it could have an effect on who we are as people in a kind of deep and profound way, but also in a way that's often related to learning and to thinking and to ideas. And again, qualities like curiosity, open-mindedness, intellectual humility, intellectual courage, and tenacity are a way of kind of giving expression to that something more, that something personal about education that got many of us as educators into the profession in the first place. So I certainly find with educators that the language resonates, and I think it can be helpful to see it, to connect that language to what we really value and desire as educators. I'll say something about the school now. Yes, so I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that I was writing about intellectual virtues at a very academic level for at least 10 years, and then had an opportunity to begin applying this work. And that opportunity was simply that a good friend of mine came up with the sort of out of the blue, harebrained idea of trying to start a school together that would focus, we through conversation then decided would focus on intellectual character formation. And kind of the guiding question was something like, what would it look like to teach reasonably traditional academic knowledge and skills, the things you need to teach at most academic institutions. What would it look like to design an entire school around the goal of helping students make progress in some of these virtues in the context of academic teaching and learning? So not as a separate program, not as something extracurricular or even co-curricular, but what would it look like to design a teaching and learning environment, one that at some level is oriented around transmitting knowledge and skills, but in a way that was also richly and deeply informed by the goal of helping students to practice and grow in these qualities. And that was kind of the guiding, animating vision. And both of us are philosophers. That's a fairly philosophical question. And so it started off as just an idea or conversation between two philosophers. And we met and talked about this idea for a couple of years and finally realized what we were getting ourselves into. We didn't know what a charter school was, but we had this idea that, it's publicly funded, but it's something that individuals in a community can start, and we have a certain amount of freedom as to what the curriculum or the guiding philosophy would be, and so on. And so once we got into sort of wrapped our heads around the challenge we were getting ourselves into, we realized, this isn't something we can do, or at least do well, unless we have a fair amount of external funding, because as you probably know, charter schools only get state funding once they're up and running. And so at that point, we approached the John Templeton Foundation and proposed a kind of complex project that had some research and design components, but also that would involve the founding of a charter middle school systematically designed around this vision that I've just mentioned. And we received a grant of a little over $1 million from the John Templeton Foundation to execute this project. And over the following couple of years, no one managed to get in our way. And in the fall of 2013, the Intellectual Virtues Academy of Long Beach opened its doors in Long Beach, California. And so it's been operating for over 10 years. And it does exactly what we had initially envisioned, in the sense that it is systematically designed around creating opportunities and creating a culture and creating a professional environment and a curriculum and pedagogy that would be fertile ground for students to practice and be formed in these virtues. Again, not as a separate enterprise, but as part of the goals of teaching and learning and acquiring academic knowledge and skills. So the school's been around for over 10 years. It's doing very well according to all measures. High school was started subsequently. That's also doing well. They're very diverse environments and very positive environments. People are doing great work, and they really are spaces where educators from all over the world can and have come to sort of see what it might look like to put some of these ideas into practice.
Well, if we had more time, I'd love to hear about the professional development plans and the curriculum and how you choose teachers and how you, all of those kinds of things. Not you, but they. And
yes, I'd recommend talking to Jackie Bryant is the principal of the Intellectual Virtues Academy. She'd be a wonderful person to have a conversation with about these things. I'd be happy to put you in touch with her.
Yeah, well, maybe that'll be a future podcast. Well, thanks for letting me nerd out, because this is an intellectually seductive conversation for me. Hopefully, folks are still listening and haven't become too bored with the wonkiness and the nerdiness. Where should they find you? Should you want to be found? What kinds of things do you want to get out there for folks to find you?
I'm not easy to find. I'm not really on social media, but certainly if listeners are interested in any of these ideas, I encourage them to look at the book you mentioned, which is Deep in Thought, A Practical Guide to Teaching for Intellectual Virtues, published in 2021 by Harvard Education Press. It really is, I know a lot of what we've talked about has been pretty philosophical and nerdy, but this book is written for someone who's just coming to these ideas for the first time and with a very practical focus in mind. If you're interested in nerding out even more, I wrote a book in 2011 called The Inquiring Mind that is much more philosophical and theoretical that you could look at. Another book that I'll mention that is, if you want to just kind of go a little bit deeper with some of these individual virtues that you and I have talked about, there's an excellent book called The Excellent Mind by Nathan King, Oxford University Press. I think it was published in 2021 as well. Also written for a general audience, but just really rich. The author, Nate King, is a philosopher as well, but has a real gift for making these ideas practical and relatable. So that's another book that I would turn listeners' attention to.
So you said Excellent Mind by Nate King?
Yep, The Excellent Mind by Nathan King, yes.
Okay. Well, we'll hunt those down and put them in the show notes so folks can find those easily. Like I said, I appreciate the conversation. It's fun for me to talk about this stuff. It's usually fun for me to talk with just about anybody here, but this is certainly in my wheelhouse of wonkiness and nerdiness. So, as I always say, I hope folks find it helpful. And again, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Good talking to you.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.